Hey guys, it's Courtney, and I'm here with another video for Trinity Stamps. Today I'm going to be creating a pretty quick, clean, and simple card using the Mr. Snailman stamp set. And this is a new release, and this will be available on February 1st. So I am starting with a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock here. And I'm going to bring out my Misty because the way I had created my masks, I kind of created my ground along with the mask of the little mailbox there. So I'm using my mask to line up my stamps so that these go perfectly with one another and I can kind of create one mini little scene here on the bottom right hand corner of my card panel. So once I had my stamps lined up, I closed my Misty door. I'll remove that mask and then go ahead and stamp my images, and I'm stamping with Blackout ink by Ink on 3. This is a Copic Safe ink, but you can really use any Copic Safe ink here. Once my images were stamped out, I will go ahead and remove those masks and place them directly over my images, including the little ground that I had kind of freehand cut. I didn't even use a paper trimmer. It's as straight as I could get it. And I had a little bit of trouble aligning up my mask here just because, especially the post of my little mailbox there is kind of thin, but because it's so thin, you can kind of manipulate the mask the way you want it. You can kind of bend it as you're placing it down. But then again, I had problems with the little snail too, which is a very easy image to fussy cut and to line up. But for whatever reason, I was struggling with this one. And because I'm going to be doing some ink blending in the background, you do want to make sure that you cut right along the black line and line up the mask as best as you can so that you don't get any white outlines around your image. So I'm going to go ahead and use just two colors of Distress Oxides here. I'm using Tumbled Glass and Stormy Sky, and I'm using one of the blendability brushes here, just concentrating the darker part being in the bottom right-hand corner, and then I'll kind of blend that out with the Tumbled Glass, pretty much fading out to white. I'm just concentrating on my little scene being in the lower right-hand corner, not really too concerned about having too much white space here. You guys probably know by now I like clean and simple. So once my ink blending was done, I'll go ahead and carefully remove my mask, just keeping in mind that the Distress Oxides do stay wet a little bit longer, and you just want to be careful when you tear off those masks that you don't rip the cardstock along with it. And I did take an EK Success journaling pen just to fill in some of the areas, the solid parts of the images that I didn't necessarily mask. This ended up not being necessary, being I kept my stamps right in my stamp positioner. I will go ahead and restamp everything after I get them colored, so I will have that bold black outline that I started with. So I'm going to start off with the envelopes here, and because these are going to be or appear to be white, I want to start off with my lightest color. I do plan on using pinks and reds, and those colors tend to bleed. If you touch the tip of the marker at all on them, you'll kind of bleed those out onto the envelope. So I'm going to color these first with just my C3 and my C1, just adding shadowing where one overlaps the other. Next, I'll move on to the snail, and I'm going to start with the shell and cover up the entire area with my lightest color, and I'm using my E30s for the entire snail. Next, I'm going to go in with my darkest color, which is the E35, and I'm just going to be adding my shading where I guess where there would be texture to the shell itself. Then I'm just going to barely touch the tip of the marker in these shadowed areas just to basically add a little bit more texture. You know how some snails have those funky designs on them? That's what I was going for here. So I'm just, like I said, barely touching the tip of the marker. Then I'll go in with the E33 and create even more dots, but just extend those out just a tiny bit further than I did with the E35. Same thing with the E31, just blending that out a little bit further, going over the dots that I've already created and extending those out even further. And then finally back to the E30, I created little tiny dots all over the place, and you'll see that these dots kind of blend in with one another, but you still are left with some of that texture. For the snail's body, I'm going to be using my E30s again, but my lightest color here will be my E31, just putting a little bit of shading on the base of his little neck there and mouth and on the base of his tail with the E37, blending that out with the E33, and then finally going back to that E31 to fill in the rest of the area. For his little antennas, I think they're called, you couldn't really see it because I didn't mask these off, obviously. So I went in with the E33 just so that you can kind of see those a little bit better. Next, I'm going to create some or add some color with some R80 markers to get some pinks in here. I'm going to be doing the mailbox, the little hat, and the present that he's got carrying on his back there. Going in with my lightest color and adding my shaded areas, which will be on the bottom part of the mailbox, on the inside of the mailbox, and that little lid part that's open. For the present, it will be off to the left-hand side, being this is kind of dipped down, and underneath the lid of the box as well. Going in with the darkest color, going over those same areas that we had mapped out with the lightest color, blending that out with my darkest midtone, then my lightest midtone, and just leaving a very small area for my highlight color. The least amount of color that you should be using is your darkest color and your highlight. Your main colors should always be your midtones, whether you're using just one, if you're using a 3-color blend, or if you do use a 4-color blend, the 2 middle colors should be primarily what you're using. So you'll see I just leave a little bit off to the right-hand side of that present, the top part of the mailbox, and the right part of his little hat there for that R81. For the little hearts, the heart that's coming out of the mailbox, the little flag on the mailbox, and the hearts on the envelopes, I'm going to be switching over to keeping with the R markers, but more of a true red. So I'm covering these with my lightest color, adding some shading with the darkest color, which is actually the same darkest color that I used for the pinks. And for that little heart coming out of the mailbox, the shading would be where it's kind of inside the mailbox. And for the hearts on the envelopes, I'm just adding a teeny tiny bit. These are so tiny, guys, you don't even need to add any shading, but I had the markers out, so I figured why not? You just want to be super careful that you don't have any of your colors bleed onto the white area of the envelopes. So next we're going to do the grass, which I totally picked the wrong colors here initially. Actually, I lie. I did the post of the mailbox, and I'm just going to make this like a wooden post with some E50 markers, just concentrating my darkest area being off to the left-hand side. Now we'll go in with the grass. So I'm covering up the entire area with my lightest color, which was initially the YG01. And because my ink blending kind of faded off to white, I wanted my grass to be the same way. So I'm using the YG01 just to get my paper saturated so that my blending is a little bit easier. Next, I'll go in with the YG17, and I'm just going to be coloring in the little blades of grass that are part of the images and add a little bit of a shadow underneath the snail and underneath the mailbox. Blend those shadows out a little bit with the YG06, then the YG03, and then back to that YG01 to cover up the entire area. And I was left with a fluorescent green, and it didn't match the rest of everything. It didn't match the sky at all. So I ended up taking kind of a light green, but it's more of a dull green. It's the G82, and I just covered up the entire area. I was still left with those shadows that we had created. They're not as noticeable, but I'm okay with that. And it kind of toned down that brightness, I guess. I took my colorless blender and just flicked from the opposite direction to make it appear as if this kind of fades off just like my sky does. I used my C3 and C1 just to fill in the center part of that mailbox to make that appear white. And I'll go ahead and restamp my images that I had left right in my Misty. That way you have that bold black outline that you kind of lose with those distress oxides. The mailbox has a line underneath where the ground is, but I wanted that to continue on to the entire little scene there that we had created. So I'm taking that EK Success journaling pen and a straight edge just to have that continue throughout my entire scene. Next, I took the sentiments. There's a few different options that you have as far as what you want your sentiment to say. I took two of them, used my grid mat just to make sure that they were lined up before popping that onto my acrylic block. And I'm going to go ahead and stamp this with VersaFine Onyx Black ink right above my little scene there, and realized that I wanted white space on the card for sure. I wanted this to be really clean and simple, but I was left with a little bit too much white space. I should have spaced everything out a little bit further. So I ended up trimming down my panel by about a quarter of an inch on the top and off to the left-hand side. And then I'm going to be using some fun foam to adhere this to a top folding A2 size note card. Now, I prefer to use the wet glue whenever I'm using the fun foam. I know that a lot of people use the really strong double-sided tape. I find that if I use my wet glue, which I use Tombow Mono Multi Glue, I have a few seconds to reposition it to the where I want it. I'm not great at lining it up perfectly the first time around, so this gives me a minute or two to kind of make sure everything is right. You will want to make sure that you put this under something heavy because it does not dry as fast as it does paper to paper. So I usually just put it under my MISTI for a minute. I added a little bit of sparkle to some of the objects within the little scene there, and that is it. That is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by, and have a great day.